Okay, well, I grew up on Long Island. Um, we lived in Wantagh, and then we moved to the North Shore of Long Island when I was in 8th grade. Interestingly enough, we moved to Cold Spring Harbor, which was where the eugenics records office was, and in high school, I worked there. Little did I know that that was the bastion of the eugenics movement, and so much of the work that I've done professionally actually bubbled up there. But when I was in high school, it was all covered up then in the 60s. There was no discussion of what had gone on there. And that was not known for a number of years later. When I was a senior in high school, I got a job at the Cold Spring Harbor Labs working with James Watson. Now, I don't mean working with him in the labs. I mean, I was responsible for packing the symposium books. But it happened to be in the office where he'd often be around. So it was pretty thrilling to have James Watson around you. And I would drive every day from school down Davenport Road. Well, Charles Davenport was a major eugenicist, as you may know, and I was living in the town as a Jewish person in an area where there were very few Jews, where basically the beginning of the eugenics movement was born, or some say was born, and all the Nazi laws on sterilization and the destruction of the Jewish race, a lot of that evolved out of some of the work at Cold Spring Harbor. Harry Laughlin was very involved in the eugenics movement along with Charles Davenport, and I actually was packing books in the building that said Eugenics Records Office, Harry Laughlin. Now, I didn't know what that meant at that time. And in the 60s, or I guess 60s, 1969, 1970, when I was there as a senior in high school then, there was really not any conversation about the history of what went on. There was rather excitement about the discovery of the double helix. And Watson's book then had come out, and that was all celebrated. And it was really after probably another number of years, and then all the interest in the mapping of the genome, that a lot of this history came out. And now, all the history of the eugenics movement, all these wonderful photographs are at Cold Spring Harbor. So, and a lot of my research later on in my life, it was in that area. So it actually all sort of came full circle. But growing up as a teenager in Cold Spring Harbor and being Jewish, it was not all a positive experience. I mean, there were still very few people there living there who were Jewish, and it did have some of a sense of not being welcome. I don't know what impact that had on me, but it probably had some. The other impact probably of my childhood that may have something to do with my sensitivity about these issues is my father had a heart attack at I was 8 years old, so he was a young man at the time, and my grandfather lived with us after he had a hard time of it after his wife died. So he was in the house with us, and then my father had a heart attack, and about 3rd or 4th grade, I just got to be very obese. I don't know whether it had anything to do with what was going on around me or whatever, but I think that I was a smart kid. I wasn't a very athletic kid, and I was sure of myself intellectually, but probably feeling a little insecure that people would yell out, "There's the fat girl." But in 8th grade, I went to a camp to lose weight, and I got, you're looking surprised, which is nice, but to basically go to a camp to lose weight, and then the rest of my life I've just really watched it, done a lot of exercise and watched it. But so those things might have had something to do with sort of making me more sensitized to issues involving protecting people. I was the president of my high school and the top of my class. I went to Princeton the first year. I was going to college and applying to college just at the time when some of the Ivy League schools chose to go co-ed. So actually, I applied to Yale and Princeton and Cornell in Michigan or something like that. I got into Princeton, and I wanted to go there because it had a school of public affairs, the Woodrow Wilson School. And at that point, I thought I might be president of the United States. We still haven't had a woman be president of the United States. But I was very interested in politics, and I was very interested in public policy, and that's why I went there. But I was driven, and it was expensive for my family to send me there. So I landed up having enough advanced placement credits from high school that I skipped a year of college. And then, so I landed up graduating with the first class of women, although I actually started with the second class. And then I did a program that I don't think exists anymore, where I was able to do my last year of college and my first year of graduate school at the Woodrow Wilson School together. So in 4 years, I did 6 years of work. And so it was really pushing. I think I was an overachiever, some might say. But I also, when I got to Princeton, one, I noticed that being Jewish, again, very much in the minority back in the 70s. It was the beginning of the whole fight against the Vietnam War. I was there at a very interesting time. I got very interested in politics at Princeton. I was on some committee that involved the faculty and the students. I was a student rep at that. And I also was very sensitive to gender issues at the time. I mean, this was just when Betty Friedan's book was coming out, some things we just so take for granted now. But we were so in the minority at Princeton. And I was vocal enough to be able to speak up when I thought something wasn't right. And my mother, who's now 95, saved a clip of an article I wrote when I was in college about something that had upset me, either in the classroom or some statement that was made. There was one woman on the faculty at the time at Princeton, and look now, there's been a woman president at Princeton who is extremely successful, and so much of the administration and the deans have been women at Princeton. So things have really changed, but it was an odd place to be, but a fantastic education. And I was, an overachiever. What can I say? I worked very hard. Just to put it in historical perspective, I had the opportunity to be in a workshop, I think it was in my junior year, and with the other undergrads in the program, and ours was to develop a health care insurance scheme for the United States. And at the time, Richard Nixon was president, and his proposal was more liberal than the Affordable Care Act and what passed. But it was a fascinating experience. I very much believe we should have a single-payer system. I thought that was the only fair way to do it. Just a few years before then, we had passed Medicare and Medicaid, because those were done in the mid-65, 66. And one of the architects of the Medicare program was one of my teachers at Princeton, Herman Summers. He had a major impact on my work, and so did Uwe Reinhardt, who's a health economist, and always said, because my handwriting was so bad, I really should have gone to medical school. And so by the time I went to college, and I'm not quite sure why, I knew I wanted to do something to change the healthcare system. Maybe it was the experiences of my dad being sick at such a young age. I don't really know, but that's where my passion was. And I knew I couldn't go to medical school because I couldn't stand the sight of blood. And my chemistry teacher in high school told me, girls don't do science. I mean, things that would never be said right now, but he discouraged me from going into science. So my father was a lawyer, and as I said, at a very young age, had a heart attack. He did not want me to go to law school. It was a hard life for him. And but he was fascinated by my graduate school education, and he was fascinated by politics and the political process. And I think his assumption, and he was very supportive of my education, I think his assumption was that I would go on to get a PhD in maybe health economics and do something that way. And he was not happy when I said I wanted to go back to law school. However, when I graduated law school, it was his idea. And he had been a trial attorney. He was a trial lawyer. I'm a plaintiff's a lawyer, which, you know, some years he did well and some years he didn't. Those kinds of lawyers don't get paid unless they win, as you know. And so he just didn't want that life. You know, he didn't. I think it was that he didn't want the life for me. But when I won the Trial Advocacy Award in law school, it was, I think, one of his proudest moments. And I'll always remember that. I mean, he died at a young age, but he was there at my graduation. And I was just proud. But so I remember fighting with him about it. I mean, really fighting about this decision. It was further complicated by the fact that my husband, who had gone to law school right out of undergrad, didn't like law school. And he had made the decision that he wanted to go back and become a child psychologist, which my father just certainly couldn't understand. So my loving husband not only had to watch me go to law school, but then to become a law professor and a dean of a law school, he couldn't get away from it. So he usually doesn't even tell people, but he is a lawyer. After I got out of graduate school, I made the decision that I wanted to work in the healthcare system as opposed to go into the government right away. So I was able to get a job working for a group health association, which at the time was one of the only consumer-owned and operated HMOs. Well, in the early 1970s, that was considered the panacea. Health maintenance organizations were going to solve the delivery and access in healthcare. So I thought it would be good to work at one. Well, as the timing worked, which was great, soon after I got there, the government passed a law about federally qualifying HMOs. And this was one of the first to be qualified. And my job, one of my jobs, was to get it qualified. So I was in it at the very beginning and got to experience this alternative way of delivering care. And I also thought it was really important to work in, if I wasn't going to be a doctor, I had to figure out that, how to work within that health system. And that was a turning point for me where I realized if I wasn't going to be a doctor, they weren't going to listen to you as an administrator. So having a graduate degree in public and international affairs with an expertise in health policy wasn't enough. So, but they did listen to lawyers. They might not have liked them, but they listened to them. And that was the turning point where I decided that I needed to get a law degree. In the 1970s, there wasn't a field called health law. The only thing near it at the time was mental health issues. And it was very strong at the University of Virginia. So I spent my first year going to law school at night at Georgetown and still working during the day. And my husband said he knew I was going to be a professor because I was the kind that liked to sit in the front row and put my hand up. I loved law school. And he said he was always sitting in the back, never raising his hand, although he did very well. So anyway, I loved it. I loved every minute of law school. I got to do the law review. I got to be mentored by Walter Wadlington, who wrote the very first casebook in law and medicine, which I then used when I was a teacher for a few years. there was another professor that I went down to study with at UVA that was doing mental health work, and he was not an attorney, he was a psychiatrist named Browning Hoffman, and tragically he died a year or so after I got there, which was just such a tremendous disappointment. But I got to know Walter Wadlington and work with him a lot, and like I said, it was just a newly evolving field. Um, but he was clearly one of my mentors, and he was very encouraging. Actually, even while I was in law school, he was trying to push me to think about going into an academic life. For some reason, I thought I was so old already. I think maybe I was 26 or 27 because I didn't do a judicial clerkship. I thought I was too old for it. And having then gotten to academics, that's pretty expected. I did do law review, but I did not do a judicial clerkship. And then I had to figure out, well, what to do in order to take all this interest in health. And the natural thing to do would have been to go work for health. At the point, it was called HEW, Health and Education Welfare. Now it's HHS. But my mentors down there said, we would really encourage you to go work in a law firm. And I said, I was, a liberal. I go, I can't work in a law firm where people have to keep track of their minutes and billable hours. That's just not me. And they said, well, for a few years, you will get great mentoring. And I was able to make the connection with Covington & Burling in Washington, D.C., which is a very large corporate law firm, but they had this practice, a unique practice, where they represented state health and welfare organizations, usually against private companies or the feds, in trying to get more money for federal programs or federal state matches under Medicaid. And it was perfect because I had fantastic mentor, Chuck Miller. I was in this incredibly interesting practice in doing health and social welfare stuff. And I was on the right side, but I was making a lot of money. So what could be bad about that, So it was a wonderful experience. But I was not that comfortable in the corporate structure, except there was an outlet every year, and that was putting on a theatrical review. And I was 9 months pregnant, which, as it was unusual in a law firm because there weren't very many females at my law firm, and there were none that were pregnant. But I was 9 months pregnant, and they put on this play, which was a takeoff on Fiddler on the Roof, and it was called Lawyer Under One Roof because the firm had moved to a new location and it had a rooftop place to eat. And I did the number that Zero Mostel had done. Instead of If I Were a Rich Man, it was If I Were a Partner, and I did the bitty bitty booms moving my 9-month pregnant body. It was probably the highlight of my career at Covington and Burling. But anyway, I always did theater. I always loved doing theater, and even in college, I was doing the Triangle Club. So that was just a great outlet for me. And of course, it's still what I have this passion for. But that was a really fun thing to do. The other thing at Covington, two other things at Covington that are memorable. One was when I was a first-year associate, and at large law firms, first-year associates aren't rushing into court. But I had the responsibility of dealing with the Federal Register when they would put out notices about some new rulemaking or something like that, and then writing for the state. We represented like all the states in this professional organization, and we would send them information. And there was a very, very strange change in this rule. And I said, well, there's always a phone number of somebody to call. And it was just when the administration was changing from Carter to Reagan. So I got some very unhappy person on the phone on the other end. And I said, I don't really understand this. It was about retroactive payments to states. Like you had to put in all your bills by a certain time, and then you could expect you could do things retroactively, and they were going to change that. Well, that had major implications for the state of New York, state of Maryland, a number of other states that we actually did represented. So the guy said, I asked him a bunch of questions. I said, I don't understand this, and how can you do that pursuant to da-da-da-da-da-da? I'm a first-year associate. How can you do? He goes, I'm just going to tell you one thing. He said, sue us. And then he hung up. And I'm like thinking, like, why are we suing them? So I ran into my partner's office, and I said, you know, something's not right here. He goes, write me a memo. You know, it's just typical, write me a memo. So I did some research, and I made an argument that, in fact, this was not legal. This was contrary to the statutory provisions. And we went, and it was getting close to the end of the fiscal year, and if you don't get into court by a certain time or get an injunction, the money will go back to the Treasury. So at the lower court level, I can't remember now, did we lose or did we win, but whatever, it went to the courts. We brought in a class action, a number of the states joined together. It was fascinating work because I had to get affidavits from all of them. You know, I don't remember how many, 12 states or something. Well, it ultimately went to the Supreme Court. And I didn't get to argue it, but I mean, here we were at the Supreme Court. And you know what? I don't even remember if we won or not. But ultimately, or maybe they didn't take cert. Maybe they didn't take cert. See, I don't remember now. But because it then went back to Congress and they worked some deal out with the states, and they got a significant amount of money returned to them. And I was a first-year associate. I was like, so that was just a absolutely wonderful experience. So between that and being in the show, those are probably the highlights. But then the other thing that was great about Covington that's relevant to what happened after, they had this fantastic program, which was a real selling point for me to go there. And every 6 months, they sent a few associates, their paralegals, and their secretaries to the local legal services office to work for 6 months. And you got your Covington salary, not your legal services salary. Well, you can imagine the legal services offices were happy to see us, but they were really happy to see the secretary because they were fantastic secretaries. You know, they're thinking like I was a third-year associate or a fourth-year associate. Anyway, it was a fantastic experience. And it really showed you how the other half lives. I mean, it was in a poor neighborhood in Washington, D.C., and I really felt I was making a difference. I didn't get into court much, but I was in landlord-tenant negotiations almost on a daily basis. And probably one of the most wonderful experiences was I had a client in a wheelchair who couldn't get into Section 8 housing because he was in a wheelchair and they didn't have, the doors weren't wide enough back then. You know, this was before a lot of the protections that we now have. And one day I was in the anteroom before you went into the court with one of the lawyers for one of the slumlords. But we had gotten to become friends. And I said, you know, do you want to really do something that could help someone today and you'll feel good? And I negotiated with him that they modified an apartment that they owned so that this man could go live there with his children. And I thought, I might be being a social worker and not being a lawyer, but boy, it feels good. While I was at the legal services office, then I got a call out of the blue from the University of Maryland. I hadn't really, I think I had a small child at the time, and I was thinking about having another one. And I was realizing I didn't want to be at Covington the rest of my life, but I didn't really know where I was going next. But so anyway, I got this call of the blue. Would I be interested in coming to the University of Maryland to think about a job? And I had never really thought seriously about teaching, and I never went on the teaching market. So I just went to the interview, and I'm looking, it's in Baltimore, right up the street from here. And I'm looking outside the window while I'm talking to the dean, and I'm going, are all those other schools on this campus the health system? Because I saw the social work school, the medical school, the nursing school, the pharmacy school, the dental school, and I said, this is a gold mine. I said, he says, well, the law school hasn't really had anything to do with any of these schools. Probably if it was up to them, they would move us off campus so they could get the law school space for labs. So, which really meant there wasn't much of a relationship or a positive relationship. So I said, well, what about trying to start something at the law school where we could have a law and healthcare program? So he goes, would you like to do that? I go, yeah, I'd like to do that. He says, oh, great. But I still had 4 courses to teach. I had then soon found out I was pregnant with my second daughter. I lived in Bethesda, and I was commuting every day. And he said, sure, you could do it. Well, it was my dream. And by the end of the first year, we had already sort of created this. So this was 1983 to 1984, so it's 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago. And then a few years later, I was able to hire somebody. So then there were the 2 of us. And this is a legacy. Then, and because we were a state school, we had created a relationship with the state legislature to really get involved in the making of policy. And I saw the responsibilities and the opportunities of being a state school and trying to connect up our role as lawyers as health leaders. And as you may know, every major healthcare regulatory institution is in Maryland. CMS is here, and then the FDA is here, and then of course there's the NIH and all the science organizations. And so we had that niche. We could teach the regulation of healthcare issues, and then our students would have the opportunities to be placed in these places. The other thing is the state legislature had a lot of real interest in work in this area. And, you know, it was the times there were the right to die stuff. One of my first areas I worked in was the right to health care and the EMTALA law, which was the first major scholarly piece I did, trying to create an opportunity that you couldn't be dumped in the parking lot when you showed up in an emergency room. So my first area of work was in that. And then I moved into other areas that involved reproductive health areas. I've always been interested in women's health issues. And then all of this evolved into what were the ethical issues raised by this. Is always particularly when getting involved in women's health, it became clear a major ethical issue was the exclusion of women in clinical trials. And whereas research ethics is often looked at as protecting, you know, we have to protect subjects, I was very interested in making sure they got included. And my first sabbatical, I've taken pretty much all my sabbaticals at the NIH, because I'm really a believer, like I said, of having a real world, you know, reality check. And my first one, this becomes very relevant to sort of how I got involved, but my first one was just when the AIDS epidemic was moving into women. And the paradigm of the public health experts was, oh, there's a bisexual man and he doesn't tell the wife that he is really with men, and that's how she gets infected. Well, in fact, the paradigm was often that the first person who found out they were infected was the pregnant woman, because that's where very few people were getting tested back then. But women who were being tested when they were pregnant were finding out they were HIV infected, but we weren't treating them because we were afraid to give them AZT, thinking it would be toxic. So we treated pregnant women different than people. If we had just treated them like everybody else, we would have prevented a whole generation of babies being born with HIV. I mean, I think that's really a cautionary tale about how to look at protecting people. So one of the things I worked on was trying to get the regulations changed because it said that a woman who was pregnant who wanted to be in research, because at the time all these drugs were still being studied as research, needed the permission of the partner unless they could show that that was not in best interest. Well, I was arguing, and I had done some empirical work to support that, that there was a big risk of violence and abandonment involving that. Plus, the partner was probably already infected. He had infected her. So like, why did you need to get the partner's permission in order to allow her to be in the research? This has been going on for many years, and we have made progress on that provision. I mean, I think it kind of gets interpreted loosely when it needs to be by the researchers, but there's still fights going on about whether pregnant women can be part of research. And it's not coming from a bad place, but pregnant women get sick independently of whether they're pregnant or not. And so what are we doing? We're making them all guinea pigs. We don't have it in a controlled study. They're just all guinea pigs because you still have to treat them. I think this is a major research ethics dilemma, and one that I've sort of been involved in for over 20 years, 30 years. And it's like, there's not an easy answer. But we made a little bit of progress. And I think that AZT not allowing pregnant women to be in the studies and be given that is a cautionary tale. While I was at the NIH on one of my sabbaticals at around 1990 or so, 1990, 1991, was just at the beginning of the new project to map the human genome. And I was at the National Institute for Child and Human Development. One of the very unique things they wanted to do at NIH was to create a grant program for the ethical, legal, and social implications of genetics. Now, this brings us back full circle to my high school experience with eugenics, or not knowing it was eugenics. But Jim Watson, who was going to run this project, whether he meant it or not, recognized that he needed to address these issues if he was able to counter the fears that we were now going to have about the implications to our society for getting all this genome information. And a response to that was, well, we'll create a grant program to study the ethical, legal, and social implications. That's not what NIH was all about. And we're talking about a very little bit of money, but eventually it evolved to a set-aside of up to 5% of all the extramural budget for the Human Genome Institute. And that still exists today. And one of my current privileges that I've had is, having been on leave for a few years from the law school, it was to help to create a division of genomics in society that was larger than just this ELSI grant program. When I was there in the early 1990s, there was a major discovery, and that was that there appeared to be this new mutation that was associated with certain forms of breast cancer and ovarian cancer, BRCA1 and BRCA2. And clearly this was going to have major implications for women's health. And then there became further information that it might have a higher degree of there might be a few very clear mutations associated with the Ashkenazi Jewish population. Well, this was about 1994, at that point. And I thought, this is an interesting issue, and this has got a lot of ethics questions behind it. Because NIH wanted to do a study in Washington, D.C. area with the Ashkenazi Jewish population to see if they get a better handle on whether or not this was more common in that community. Well, I was interested in studying, based on this eugenics story, what impact genetic information has in certain communities. So this was like, wow, and I mean, and I am in this community. So I got involved in working on the development of the study, and it was one of the first times that there was an interest in, when they got consent, they were not only going to ask consent with respect to using the samples for this, but also asking permission if they could use the samples for future studies about cancer and future studies. They didn't actually have to do it that way back then because it was de-identified by name. But as I'd argued, it wasn't de-identified by ethnicity or race. So the stigma associated with it, if there was a stigma, was still identifiable. It just wasn't to the individual. So this created a whole evolution of a conversation between informed consent and disclosure and research rights and who gets to control the samples. It's still going on today, as you know. But that was an interesting real-world study to be involved in. And it was fascinating because the synagogues had to decide how to, whether they were going to control or not who was going to be tested. Because they had people in their synagogues who were converts. They were not Ashkenazi Jews. They had converted, but they didn't want to exclude them. So they would come in, they'd give their, feel good about giving, they probably then went and threw it out. But it was an interesting question about being a community. The other interesting thing about it was the roles the rabbis played, because they were kind of recruiters. And so that raised some interesting ethical questions too, that it also happens in the black churches with sickle cell issues. But this interconnection between identity, like the Jewish gene, I mean, most people that have BRCA1 and 2 are not Jewish because there's so few Jews in this country anyway, but there is some association that has evolved from that. So, do you want to have genetics associated with certain groups that then become stigmatizing? And in the Jewish community, I did some empirical work on this. What makes someone identify as being Jewish? Is it a religion? Is it an ethnicity? Well, one of the only things that holds Jews together sometimes is their fear of anti-Semitism, or this Holocaust and the history of all of that. And, of course, as generations move forward, that may become less of an issue. So the irony of all of this is, like, in one way, the Jewish community is saying, this is great, we're learning more, we're studying about this in our population. And on the other hand, is it going to stigmatize it? Are we going to be redlined in certain areas? And it was like on a collision course, about getting this more information. Well, as a result of all of this, I got increasingly more interested in fears of genetic discrimination and privacy concerns, because the studies were showing that people didn't want to participate in research because, remember, they're healthy. And the risk-benefit analysis of when you're healthy is very different than the risk-benefit analysis when you're sick. Because I just believe, when you're sick, you're not really worrying about all of those things. You want to just know you're going to get well, and whatever they need to do that, do it. But when you're healthy, your risk-benefit analysis is different, because it's predictive information. What does it mean then for your future? And then who do you tell, and who do you keep a secret from, and when do you tell your children? And what does it do to the group dynamic of blood relatives versus people that aren't blood relatives? I mean, there's all these complicated issues. So I started to write and think about that. And there was, at the NIH, a consortium that developed together to look at BRCA1 and 2 and its implications. So that was in the early to mid probably 1990s. That consortium model 20 years later still exists for different things. And um, so that's been part of what's been really exciting working at the Genome Institute the last few years, because there's all sorts of consortiums now for clinical sequencing and its implications. There's even a new group that's been put together for looking at the implications of doing newborn sequencing of newborns as opposed to newborn screening, what the implications would be, and would you tell, and who do you tell, and there's no answers, which is what got me interested in then trying to figure out new creative ways to get our communities to really think about this together with health professionals and the genomics community. And that was the push behind my Drama of DNA project. So when I was in my sabbatical with Elizabeth Thompson that I told you early in the 1990s, I was pregnant. And I was in my late 30s by then, and there had been this new technology that just evolved as an alternative to amniocentesis called CVS, chorionic villi sampling. And since with my other girls, actually, I didn't really do any technology, and I didn't want to know the sex or anything like that, but I was on a consensus panel in the early 1980s about using ultrasound during pregnancy. And I was pregnant with my second daughter at the time, and all these OBGYNs and others are just saying, why don't you want a sonogram? Why don't you want an ultrasound or whatever? And I said, well, it's just technology. What do I want that for? You can have a picture inside. Well, nowadays, it's not even a question mark. But we actually recommended at the time on this consensus panel that you not get this unless there was a medical reason for it. In part, there were some concerns about whether it was emanating, whether it was what the long-term impact was. Well, of course, now you can go to a mall and go get an ultrasound and get a picture of your baby. It's very different. But at that time, there was a lot of pressure. And I do have to admit that a week or two after that, I did get one. So it's whatever. But anyway, I was pregnant again. And I was, I think, maybe 38 years old. So I decided to have this technology. And everything seemed to be fine. And I got the results. And actually, they told me it was a boy. And I have two other girls. And I was moving along okay, and then I had a miscarriage at 17 weeks. And it was a natural miscarriage. I mean, it was a result of something going wrong. But it got me thinking, what if things hadn't been okay with the CVS? And I had to make a decision very quickly about what I was willing to parent. Because that's what it really comes down to. And most interestingly enough, this very much breaks down by ethnicity. But at least in the Jewish community, most people, when they get bad information, they decide to terminate if they can. So, this was another collision course between disability rights and abortion and technology, all that raises great ethical questions. But anyway, this was the time when I was on my sabbatical with this colleague that I became close to, who was a genetic counselor, and she was actually very helpful when I was going through this loss. And we decided we made a proposal to do a 3-day symposium at the NIH. Now, I remember them saying, don't use the A word, a lot of sensitivity about that. But we did a 3-day symposium on the impact of prenatal testing on women. Women and prenatal testing, facing the challenges of genetic technology. And it was an interdisciplinary group of scholars, many who had just started out then, who are at this meeting today. And we had psychologists, sociologists, geneticists, lawyers, ethicists, and we ended up writing a book after a series of articles dealing with the issues raised by prenatal diagnosis. we just, I think it was at Case Western and Cleveland Clinic, they just did like a 20-year anniversary of this book, and like what's the same, what's different, and it had a major impact on a shift in my career. Now, would I have gotten interested in it if I hadn't had this loss? I was already interested in women's health, and I was already interested in reproductive issues, and had been very involved in the whole surrogacy debate, and when that happened in New Jersey, and egg donation and all those ethical issues. But it wouldn't have hit in the same way. You know, the personal becomes the professional, and so it was a great way to deal with the loss. I never did decide to have a pregnancy, but now I'm now a grandmother, and I'm watching my daughter having gone through this. I have an almost 7-month-old, and you know, I ask myself, are we better off? Is this a good experience? You know, this is, by the way, an area that's very hard to do research in. And you know, a lot of this is hands off when it comes to including pregnant women, for example, in research, as you know. And in fact, the play we're going to do this afternoon has a component of it involving some of these questions. But that was really a turning point for me. And the book I got translated even in Japanese, you know, and it never made us rich, but it had an impact on the dialogue, and also sort of bringing in a feminist perspective on a lot of the issues. So from that evolved probably 20 years of a commitment to this day on looking at the ethical, legal, and social implications of genetics and genomics, which I'm still doing. And trying to always be thinking about the impact that it has on gender and ethnicity and access and health disparities and things like that. So with the advent of genomic sequencing then, it raised for us many more challenges. And I think for research ethics, one of the biggest challenges, if you're going to give results back, which was sometimes the only way people that wanted to access genetic information get it, if you're going to be able to get it back, then what's the difference between research and clinical? I mean, this graying of these categories, I think, increasingly is creating a lot of questions for us about, are we overprotecting in one context and not protecting enough in the other context? And also, as we get more and more big data and more technology, there appears to be increasingly this argument that we're holding on to old values about privacy. Let's just give it up. And I think some of us old timers are resisting that. You know, these are still core principles. Let's figure out how we can accommodate this. There was increasing concern, even from the beginning of the discussion about the mapping of the human genome, but increasingly for many years, from the mid-90s on how could we send the message as a matter of policy that if you are a healthy person, but you've got some predictive information associated with you, that you won't be discriminated against and that your privacy will be protected. So in the mid-1990s, I got involved with doing some scholarship on that, looking at first what all the states were doing. And so I did an analysis of that. And from that, we started to realize that we needed to try to have a federal comprehensive approach. And in 1995, I was at the law school at the time, but together with the National Action Plan on Breast Cancer and the Human Genome Institute, we did a series of 2 workshops, one in 95 and I think one in 97. 95 was on health insurance and the second one was on workplace. And we wrote 2 pieces in Science that came out that were very, I think, well received in certain areas, that became the framework for what you would need to have if you were going to have protection against genetic discrimination and privacy. And at the core, which is at least for me, is I felt you had to marry anti-discrimination protection with privacy. So it wasn't just about saying you can't discriminate against somebody if they have a positive BRCA test, but also you can't get that information because you have to, because it's very hard to prove discrimination. Because you think about it, if you're black or if you're a woman, you see it, but you don't see this, right? So you risk a lot in trying to make a claim that you've been discriminated against. You risk less in the other contexts because they're looking at you. You're not disclosing anything private by saying you're a female, but here you are. And what if you guess wrong? Or what if you don't have good protection? So I said you have to get at it at the access point, not only at the discrimination protection. Well, so this took almost 15 years. I mean, this started in 1995, and it was in 2008 before GINA was passed. Well, the GINA, Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, GINA, what ultimately got passed was nothing like what we started with because it didn't have a private right of action, for example. And it almost passed unanimously, and George Bush signed it. So that should make you think, we had total bipartisan support for this. The regs are now out. Now we have the Affordable Care Act, so it's a question about how much we needed in the context of health insurance, but it still has the privacy provisions. And there is frustration in some members of the community. Well, what about life insurance, long-term care insurance, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. I don't know if anything's going to ever happen with that. But the rationale for doing all this is because the studies have shown that people don't want to be in research because they're fearful. All right. I'm not sure that's right. I think it's a socially acceptable excuse to say I'm afraid, because what you're really afraid about is the information and what you're going to do about it. Are you going to tell your sister who doesn't want to know? How are you going to keep a secret? When do you tell your children? It's a lot of psychosocial baggage. Well, that's very hard to quantify, and you can't discriminate against people not liking you or being afraid of you or wanting to get away from you. How are you going to do that? So this is the way we do things. But the research community is frustrated by this because when they go through the informed consent process and, the studies show that, people don't really either remember this or they don't really understand it or they don't even know about it. And also I used to say, researchers didn't go to school to be, insurance agents, or discrimination describers. That's not what they're all about. And so I think, and it's very hard to quantify it because we supposedly don't see a lot of it. Well, how would we really know? So that's been in an area where I've done a lot of work over the years. I don't know how much difference has really made, but it made for really interesting bedfellows. In 1999, after directing the law and healthcare program for a number of years, I was asked to step in as an interim dean at the law school and then the permanent dean. And I did that for 10 years. And while I was doing that, it was very hard to be able to teach and do research. But I would try to do as much as I could collaboratively with others. And one of the things that I did that I really enjoyed that actually had to do with ethics while I was the dean is I was convinced that there should be some connection between law and the arts. And so I created a program called Linking Law and the Arts in the I guess maybe 2005, 2006, I don't remember exactly. And we got a grant as part of this overall initiative to try to teach legal ethics through using the arts. And so every year, the students in the legal ethics class would write a play together based on a real world experience that happened in our clinic. And it was really a great experience. So after I left the law school, or when I announced I was leaving, I remember one of the faculty said, well, what are you going to do now? I said, I'm going to Broadway. Well, I didn't get to Broadway, but I made this commitment to learn more about narrative and the role that narrative could have in the making of policy and the telling of stories, because so much of what a good lawyer does, they're a storyteller. I mean, they have to convince a judge or a jury. And this has been a really interesting issue, for example, over the years with the abortion cases. I mean, how do you make it about the personal? And there's a lot of critique that a lot of laws that pass are based on stories and not evidence. And the law and economics community, for example, is very anti-negative narrative. And one of my colleagues who used to be at the law school, we would have friendly arguments about this all the time. But if you look at sometimes what Congress does, I mean, it is based on the personal. Why do we have, kidney dialysis covered under, where you can get stuff under Medicare, blah, 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 but not other things? Or all of a sudden there was mental health parity because there was a senator who had a lot of all those kinds of issues. So I started to think, this might really be an effective way to try to get at these controversial ethical issues that are being raised in genomics. So I started to look first at existing theater and did kind of an anthology analysis with my colleague, a colleague at Columbia named Lynn Bush, telling the story of ethics and bioethics over 200 years using theater, and divided it up historically, including the eugenics movement, but also public health issues, reproductive issues, death and dying issues. And there were plays that were placed in social context as a way to sort of teach what was going on around us while we were changing or evolving into some of our bioethical principles. So that was a great experience. And then my colleague Lynn and I started to think about, well, there aren't plays that are going to address all the issues that are evolving, especially in genomic sequencing, and we started to write plays. And this was 2011. We presented the first one at the LC World Congress, and it got picked up. There was a lot of interest in it. We wrote some work to support the theory behind it. We just kept on writing these plays, and at all these professional meetings, we would have opportunities to put them on. And what was interesting about them, we weren't using professional actors, we were using the community. But you can't play who you are. You have to play another voice. And the theory behind that is, if you get a geneticist having to be the voice of an ethicist, maybe they'll hear it in a different way. Or a nurse that is the social worker or the genetic counselor who's the lawyer or the public health official or whatever. And it's just taken off. And, is it the best or the only way to teach? Certainly not. But it is a different perspective, yes. And it has just been so much fun. And the people that are in these plays, they just expect to be invited to be in the cast the next year. So we have a lot of repeat performers, and they just take over. They're irreverent about it, they're funny about it, they embellish on the parts, and it's been a great experience to be able to pilot them at the NIH with my colleagues there, get their feedback, make the changes, and then go to the next level. So the book that The Drama of DNA is not a compilation of the plays, but it's a compilation of the narratives within the plays and the issues, with then questions at the end of each chapter. And then you can download the plays from that. And you can get a lot of this just through public access through the genome.gov as well. And it's just been a wonderful experience for us to do this. So we've really enjoyed it. I had this passion for integrating my interest in health with my interest in women. And so there was, early on in my career, this development of all these surrogacy cases that got me thinking about how did I feel about using one woman for another woman. And boy, has that debate changed. I mean, now it's celebrated as a way that you can help each other in kind of a communitarian spirit. And also, as you see evolving in a lot of research ethics and other areas that have complicated ethical debates going on about them, because they often bring in religion as well, you know, we went from thinking we were going to criminalize a behavior to thinking we weren't going to enforce the behavior, you know, we weren't going to force this contract, to regulating it. And in a democracy, that's what often happens. First, we get afraid of it, criminalize the behavior. Then we realize that's not really realistic or fair for some. So then we just say, we're not going to enforce it. You know, you're not going to have the protection of the law if you want to do this behavior. And then we finally say, it's going to happen anyway, you know, so let's regulate it. Now with surrogacy, you know, a lot of this, and open adoptions and all that, I mean, a lot of private law has evolved from that as well. But, you know, we have a society become comfortable with things over time. And look at IVF. I mean, in the late 1970s, like, oh my God. Well, now some of these reproductive technologies or surrogacy, they're seen as like altruistic in certain circumstances. Or, you know, Jimmy Fallon, you know, just the other night, his wife was able to have they had their second child through surrogacy, and it's sort of accepted. So in time, certain things change. Well, I was in looking at, again, the relationship between women and health when I was involved with the AIDS issues. We had a unique situation at the law school where we had created, we have over the years through the Law and Healthcare program, about 5 health-related clinics in which law students worked with faculty, but we had created an AIDS clinic. And what we saw was that we were getting clients who were all women, whereas across town, the guys being treated for AIDS or HIV were gay men. And we were gay white men mostly, and we were getting poor African American women. Well, in addition to getting their health care at the hospital, literally across the street from the clinic, they were being referred to our AIDS clinic because they had a lot of legal issues. I mean, some of them were losing their children, they were losing their homes, they were losing their jobs. There was so much stigma associated with it, and they feared for their lives. And 2 of our clients, both pregnant, landed up being shot by their partners when their partners found out that they were HIV positive through the birth of the child. Now, this brings me back to what I was talking to about earlier with the role the partner had in women being in research. But what it was it was a wake-up call for me, because what was happening in the clinic alerted me to a new issue I hadn't really thought about. And that was the intersection of domestic violence and HIV in women. So we got an AMFAR grant to look at this relationship and did a very interesting study of provider attitudes in this context. I'm happy to say, as a result of that, Maryland changed its rules about needing to do violence screening before you started moving forward with partner notification. And I think some of this has really changed a lot since then because, you know, there's a reason to test pregnant women now, and there's something we can do about it, which wasn't at all the case back then. But it was a good lesson for me to learn that sometimes people in our field or in ethics, you know, they don't really have the evidence. They just feel there's something going on here, or maybe they're just they have narratives which help them. But this was like two situations. I mean, just something I would never have fathomed. The other thing is, I never thought that a woman who was pregnant, when they had a death sentence back then, you know, they were going to die, would want to have a child. And that was so narrow. That was so narrowly focused. I mean, of course they would, you know, they had a drive to want to carry on. And so I think we made assumptions about what they would want that you also learn. As you age and you get more humility in this field, you realize the importance of having to listen.